Right. Hello, friends, and welcome back to The Membership, a podcast about the works and life of Wendell Berry, the farmer, poet, novelist, essayist, activist, and thinker. My name is John Pattison, and I am joined by my co-host, David Johnson. Hi, David. Welcome.
Hey, John. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. And we actually can see each other because we're recording this over Zoom. In this episode, we are going to be discussing a book called Whitefoot, a story from the center of the world. The book is written by Wendell Berry with illustrations by Davis Tisselli. I'm actually not totally sure on how to pronounce that name. And Whitefoot, as we will see, is a very interesting book because in some ways it's very different than any other book that Berry has written, but in other more important ways, it's of a piece with his other works. It is a work of fiction. It's a single story. It was first published in Orion magazine in 2007 and then in book form in 2009. And it is 60 pages long. And as I mentioned, it has these illustrations by Cassell. Dave, what kind of illustrations would you say these are? I don't know enough about art to really be able to say. What do you think?
So I don't actually know that much about art either, but I did some research, and
Oh, that's a good idea.
so
Way to be prepared.
according to the information on Tassell's website, these are lithographic prints, which is a type of hand printing process where you take a design drawn on a plate. So Tassell likes to use either crayon or pencil, according to
Hmm.
his website, and then he'll draw them on either stone or aluminum or glass. And then that plate and that illustration will be affixed onto the plate with some sort of chemical reaction. That's
Hmm.
lots of science, and then inked onto paper. For those of you who don't have the book or can't see it, there's actually some of these illustrations are on his website, but they're line drawings. They're black and white. I spent a little bit of time at the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art's website to learn a little bit about this process. And this doesn't have anything to do with Wendell Berry, but I found out that early baseball cards were lithographic prints,
Hmm.
including the Honus Wagner T206, which is the famous, most rare baseball card. And it sold for $7.25 million a couple years ago. So it's nice to see that we've got our priorities straight.
Okay, and so those were made with this lithography as well. I didn't
Yeah,
know that. Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Yeah. Well, you and I we're Barry fans, but we're also baseball fans, so that is actually pretty interesting. Um, so this book, Whitefoot, is now surprisingly out of print, and I feel a little bit bad now that we're talking about this book, knowing it's out of print. Hopefully, folks can find used copies of the book or borrow from the library. I kind of don't know why it's out of print. It's really excellent. Um, Dave, before we get into our discussion, can you lay out the basic story for the folks who may not have read this book recently or potentially even read it at all yet?
sure. So Whitefoot is about a mouse. It is set in an edge of a wooded hollow in an acre of bottomland by a river around Port William. The book says is that it takes place near the Old Keith Place, which readers of Wendell Berry's fiction might recognize as the name of the place where Mattie Keith, who is the love of Jayber Crow's life, lives at. Maddie actually doesn't marry Jayber. Spoiler alert: she marries a guy named Troy. He wrecks the place, but it is still set in the Port William fiction sort of universe. The story follows. It's just a couple months in the life of this mouse. She's born in the fall. She spends the winter in her family nest, but eventually and early on sets off to make a nest of her own, which she finds in the round glass jar with, quote, a hole shaped like an eye just big enough for a mouse to enter. The story of Whitefoot is a story of a flood. While the nest was still new, Barry writes, rain began to fall. Her nest floods. She she has to swim out of her nest. She finds a log that floats her away from the only home that she's known, toward the river. From the log, she goes to Island of Debris, and then finally to a large maple tree that has been dislodged by the flood and is also floating down what we assume is the Kentucky River. And then it kind of documents her little fight for survival. She looks for and finds food, but it's not enough. She tries to sleep, but she doesn't sleep well. She finally finds a stash of food left by a flying squirrel in an old woodpecker hole in the maple tree. And that allows her to finally eat and sleep well. She eventually comes to rest in this tree. The water recedes, and she leaves her this place that is this ark to find a new nesting place in her new home at the center of the world, which is the subtitle of the book, Whitefoot, a story from the center of the world.
Dave, there's a passage that you and I both really like where it talks about being at the center of the world. Would you mind reading that? Do you know
Yes,
which passage I'm talking about?
I think I do. I think it's on page 11 of this book. It says, she lived at the center of the world. This is one of the things every mouse knows. Wherever she was at the center of the world. That one lives at the center of the world is the world's profoundest thought. So firmly was this thought set in Whitefoot's mind that she did not need to think it. Like humans, she lived in the little world of what she knew, for there was no other world for her to live in. But she lived at the center of her world always, and of this she had no doubt.
Dave, this book for has was a camping tradition. Like we would read this every year. We would go camping with some friends, and we would read this out loud to our kids. We did that when we were camping with your family recently. What about you? Where have you read this book?
So I actually received this as a birthday present in 2015, so a few years after it was published. It is inscribed from from my from my daughter, who was 2 at the time, so she did not actually write it, but it says, "Happy birthday, Daddy. Please read this to me. Love, Sadie Joe." So that's primarily how I've read it. We read this a lot when my kids were very small. And then I think the last time I read it out loud was when our both of our families were camping together, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's great.
So so I got this book from my daughter who asked me to read it to her. The Library of Congress catalog information in the front of the book identifies it as juvenile fiction. And there are a lot of things about this book. The print format it's smaller, it's got an animal as a central character, it's illustrated. All this it suggests that it's a kid's book. But as you mentioned, John, earlier, this was originally published in Orion magazine, which isn't a kid's magazine. And in that magazine, it was accompanied by photographs of an actual real white-footed mouse rather than the illustrations that were added when it was published by Counterpoint a couple years later. So, like, my question to you is, do you think this is a kid's book? And maybe like sort of a related question, does that question even matter?
To be honest, I thought about this more than a little bit. And the short answer is that I honestly don't know if it was intended as a children's story. I kind of doubt it, but I also ultimately don't think it matters that much, really, at all. It does work as a story for younger kids better than most of Barry's other stories would, and listeners should feel comfortable reading it aloud to their younger children. But listeners with grown children or with no children will absolutely enjoy it. And I'm reminded of something that I remember reading C.S. Lewis. He said that no book is worth reading at the age of 10 that isn't equally worth reading and often far more worth reading at the age of 50. And so, with that in mind, like you mentioned, it's in Port Williams' universe. This is a book that is I think of a piece with his other work. How do you see this fitting within the rest of Barry's Port William fiction and really with his work in general?
Sure, yeah. So chronologically, just in terms of the when he published stuff, this was published in 2009. Wendell Berry first published a work of fiction in book form in 1960. So this is almost 50 years after that. All of his fiction takes place in Port William, as we've said, including this. And so there's been a lot that has happened in that community up until this point. The It includes these familiar Wendell Berry themes. Like you said, it's got attention and belonging to place. This idea of sufficiency, of appropriate scale, the idea of enough is all like throughout the this work or this story about Whitefoot, and is really embodied in this little character of Whitefoot, which is a lot. Which is a lot of fun to just be able to see those narrative threads woven throughout. This also about, like we've said, about rivers and floods, and that is also is fairly prominent both in Wendell Berry's essays and in the fiction. The first the first essay I think of always when I hear a river in Wendell Berry's fiction is the essays in The Long-Legged House. There's one called The Rise, which is about a canoe trip that he took down a flooded Kentucky River. Actually the Kentucky River. So there's also a essay in collected in the books What Are People For and in the citizenship papers called Watershed and Commonwealth about the interconnectedness of watersheds in both the human and non-human world. There's some lines in here that I think the Whitefoot embodies in her story, but that he writes about a little more explicitly in that essay. He says, "People who live at the lower ends of watersheds cannot be isolationists, or not for long. Pretty soon they will notice the water flows, and that will set them to thinking about the people upstream who either do or do not send down their silt and pollutants and garbage. Thinking about the people upstream ought to cause further thinking about the people downstream. Such ponderings on the facts of gravity and the fluidity of water shows us that the golden rule speaks to a condition of absolute interdependency and obligation. People who live on rivers, or in fact anywhere in a watershed, might rephrase the rule in this way: do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you."
Hmm.
I really like.
Yeah.
Rivers and floods also flow through, pun intended, the Port William fiction, including, as we've talked about, Jayber Crow.
Yeah, and the book that we're going to be talking about in our next episode is his new Sabbath poems collection called Another Day. These are Sabbath poems from 2013 to 2023. In a couple of different places early on in the collection, he describes himself as a lowdown man. So, like the first poem starts out with him saying, "This is a poet of the riverlands, a lowdown man of the deepest depth of the valley, where gravity gathers the waters, the poisons, the trash, where light comes late and leaves early."
It's really nice. I like that. So, like we said, Whitefoot is the little mouse, and we follow her story for a little bit, including some descriptions of her inner life.
Hmm.
John, can you
Yeah.
talk about the way that Barry balances realism and fantasy in this story?
Yeah, this book walks an interesting line, I would say. Right from the start, it seems like Barry's going to avoid anthropomorphizing. The line, maybe the very first line is her name was Peromyscus Leucopus, but she did not know it, which I don't know. But then there's the line right after it where Barry says, "I think it had been a long time since the mice around Port William spoke English, let alone Latin." And on page 8, he says that Whitefoot took a small feminine pleasure in being beautiful. And so I don't know if that's anthropomorphizing or fantasy, but it did genuinely make me wonder if small animals can take pleasure in being beautiful. Uh, I really don't know the answer to that question, and I kind of wouldn't be surprised. Um, I don't know. Do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Well, I do. So you and I both really like a book by a guy named Carl Safina called Beyond Words,
Oh yeah.
where it's a lot about the book is about sort of cognitive lives of non-human creatures. And he talks about the it's structured around orcas and wolves and elephants. Like those are his three examples. But one of the things that I recall from his writing in that book, and then in other things that I've heard him talk, is that trying to ask the question about whether or not animals perceive the world the way we do. Like, do they perceive beauty the way we do? Is kind of like the wrong question. That there is, and that it's almost just this mystery that we have to live with. That we
Mhm.
don't know how they perceive the world. But we can see, I don't know. I mean, I think that even in this book and illustrated in some of the stories in this Carl Safina book, you can see that there is if it's not if Whitefoot isn't perceiving her life as beautiful, there's she's doing things that are analogous to that, that there is a pleasure in what she in how she makes her nest, for example,
Mhm.
that that seems similar to what we do, and that's all we can really say for sure about that, is it is recognizable.
Yeah, there's a line on like early in the book, I think page 8, where he says the little life she had loved dearly and so far had taken excellent care of it.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. We all so her inner life throughout the book is it's portrayed as often portrayed as a series of imperatives too, like look out when she
Hmm.
senses a hawk coming over her, or hurry because the water is going to float her nest away if she doesn't move. I'm curious, like as we have talked about, and as you read this story, when it with it's such a small scale. What do you think about this story makes it worth telling? And do you think, is it a parable? Is it something else? Like what is it about this, and why do you think Barry decided that he wanted to write it?
I think what makes this story work is that it's not a parable. Even as if he's walking this line between fantasy and reality, I think it's mostly reality. I think it's mostly reality. It's fantasy to the extent that, well, I don't know, that we are being asked to imagine something. And but ultimately, I think what makes this work is that it is not, there's not a lot of moralizing. It's not asking you to, it's asking you to, we'll talk about this here in a little bit. Like it's asking you to empathize with Whitefoot without imagining yourself as Whitefoot. It's asking you to empathize for the creatures that are, for the and for this particular creature. And I think it's what makes the story work. I could see somebody else, including me, trying to write this story and it just being really, really bad and not working nearly as well as it does because we're trying to turn it into a parable or into a lesson and being too didactic about
Mhm.
everything. That's my take. Do you have anything that you would want to add to that?
No, but it leads into like another question I wanted to ask you about another line early on in the book, which about the size and scale of the story. It's
Hmm.
on page 11, and Barry writes, "To imagine the life and adventures of Whitefoot, you must compress your mind to her size." So, so what do you think, and what do you think this has to say about the relationship between imagination and empathy in this story in particular? And if you care to comment on fiction in general, that as well.
Yeah, I think that there is an extent to which authors are always asking the readers to imagine and empathize with their characters. But I think what makes this story work and makes it moving, and sometimes the experience that we get as a reader is that we're nervous on behalf of Whitefoot, is that we are being asked and as he said, like to compress our minds to the size of a tiny mouse that is caught up literally in the current of events. And some of this relates to the theme of the center of the world that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But some of it too is how we are reminded from time to time throughout this story of the limits of Whitefoot's own knowledge, and we're being urged, really encouraged to submit to those limits, to submit to the limits of Whitefoot's knowledge. For example, he says that Whitefoot could hardly know that way off beyond the edge of the water, the land still rose up firm. All she knew now was the moving water, the shifting light on the water, the rain and the wind. Human knowledge, maybe we know that, you know, not maybe potentially not that far off on our scale, there's dry land, but we are being asked to submit to her size, to her knowledge, where all it seems is that the world is now a world of water.
Hmm.
And it's a really, uh, not only does it make the story work, but as people who are also existing in this world, who share this world with other created beings, other creatures, we need more of this empathy and imagination. We need more of the compression of our mind down to the size of the other creatures that we share, who are our neighbors.
Hmm.
There's another line from page 11. I think we've kind of talked around this a couple of times, but it's right there in the subtitle of the book, A Story from the Center of the World. And it really is such a key theme for this work. Barry writes, wherever she was at the center of the world. That one lives at the center of the world is the world's profoundest thought. And so the last time I read this book in preparation for this recording, that was a question that was I wanted to read it read it in with that question in mind.
Hmm.
What makes this that one lives at the center of the world's profoundest thought? And I know that this was something that you thought about it a lot too, because we've talked about this in advance, but why do you think that is the world's profoundest thought, and what is Barry doing with that here?
Yeah. So in one in one instance, it's interesting because like we all know people who act like they're the center of the world, and those people kind of suck,
Hmm.
like that they. And so the idea that that is the world's most profound thought feels a little paradoxical to me. I think that the what Barry does though, and it gets back to the question of maybe even why he wrote this book, is that we are being asked to engage with a creature who is like invisible and often, beyond our notice. And we're asked to enter into that creature's imagination and inner life and experience as though they are, and to believe that they are also at the center of their world, that Whitefoot is at the center of her world. And so if you can carry those two things, I think the profundity is in carrying both of those two things in your mind at the same time.
Hmm.
I feel I am at the center of my world. It feels like it. There's no other way to live. I think Barry even says that on that in that extended quote. But so is everyone else, including a little mouse like Whitefoot. So one of the things that I noticed as I was reading this story in with that question in mind, like why is that just the world's profoundest thought? There's a paragraph on page 28 where Whitefoot is she's on this log. She's escaped her nest, but she has not, but is still feeling very sort of insecure about things. And it says, for a while, the little log floated free of trees. The wind blew it across part of a cornfield. A flock of wild turkeys were feeding in the field, walking slowly away from the rising water. And though this was surely the unhappiest day of Whitefoot's life, a pair of wood ducks was dabbling cheerfully over the submerged corn rows. Nearer the river, a great blue heron was standing as still as a post, and then, stabbing into the water with its long beak, it caught a fish and swallowed it. Later, as the water deepened beneath Whitefoot's log, a muskrat swam by at the point of its V it made along the surface. It dived, and for a second only its tail was in sight, curved like a question mark. and then too its tail disappeared. And what I loved about that little just aside in Whitefoot's story is that there are all these other creatures who are also at the center of their own world. And really, Barry could have written this book about any one of them. He wrote about Whitefoot. It feels like it feels uh, obvious and sort of inevitable now that it's like I'm holding it in my hand that he would write about a little white-footed mouse, but he could have just as easily written about those wood ducks who are having a great day.
To go along with that, as I was reading it the last time, I had sort of this it was like a almost like a tickle in the memory. Like there is something that's on the tip of my memory that I can't recall. And I was able to call it up. And the memory is of when I moved from the Midwest to the West Coast. I was driving and I listened to an audio recording of The Power of Myth, the PBS special that Bill Moyers did with Joseph Campbell, the mythologist. And sure enough, like I looked up The Power of Myth and they talked about this. And I should say I had to do multiple trips from the Midwest to the West Coast, and I listened to that Power of Myth on repeat. And so it had planted a seed there. And as I went back to the Power of Myth, I kind of had this aha moment, or certainly like it relieved a tickle in my memory. If this is even a phrase, I don't even know. Do people talk about tickle of memory?
It
It's
will
gonna
now.
be it's gonna be an act of self-control to keep this in the podcast recording. All right, so it yeah, so there it was. Like it was the Axis Mundi. Like Bill Moyers and Joseph Campbell talked about this. The Axis Mundi is the center of the world. It's that central axis that connects heaven and earth. And this is kind of what blew my mind. It's also known as the world tree. So now I'm reading and thinking about this book, Whitefoot, much of which literally takes place on a tree. That tree is her whole world. It's floating down the river. Like that is her world tree. And Joseph Campbell in The Power of Myth connects this concept of the axis mundi, the center of the world, to a story from Black Elk Speaks. Black Elk was a Lakota Sioux. He was a young boy at the during the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Black Elk tells this story in Black Elk Speaks of the time when he was 9 years old. This is a few years before the Little Bighorn. Black Elk becomes ill, very, very ill, and he has a vision. And in this vision, Black Elk is taken to the center of the earth. And he says that round about me was the whole hoop of the world. And the mountain that he was standing on, the center of the world, Black Elk identifies as Harney Peak in the Black Hills. But he says, anywhere is the center of the world. And in this vision, Black Elk says, and while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell, and I understood more than I saw. For I was seeing in a sacred manner the shapes of all things in the spirit, and the shape of all shapes as they must live together like one being. And I saw that the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that made one circle, wide as daylight and as starlight, and the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father, and I saw that it was holy. So it's I don't know if it's a major leap or if it's right there. I really don't know. But I as I think about this story being from the center of Whitefoot's world and why that is so profound. I think it's profound because every point in the world is the center of the world. Whitefoot's jar and then her tree and then her nest are the center of the world. my home in Silverton, my life here, yours in Portland, like are the center of the world. Like our lives are the connecting points between heaven and earth. We are that axis mundi, and the sacred realization is that our center is one of many centers
Mhm.
and that it's all holy. And as you were saying, I think the paradox and really what requires discipline and humility and self-control is that just because I am the center of my world doesn't mean that the world revolves around me.
Well, it also calls to mind that idea that it's, I can't remember who says it. You probably are going to be able to help me out with this, but this idea of the membership of Port William,
Hmm.
I think it's the
At
where
Burley Coulter.
is it Burley where he talks
Hmm.
about the only it's there aren't people in and out of the membership. It's
Hmm.
people who
Yeah.
recognize it and people who don't. And I think
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
where the sacredness comes in. Like we are all these access points, these entry points between heaven and earth. But the sacredness is in the awareness and attention to that. Um, Not just for ourselves, but for the other people that we are encountering every day. I think that if I had to guess, that's what is profound about that idea for Wendell Berry.
Hmm.
It certainly has been for me as I've been thinking about this book. With that, it's such a distinct phrase, the center of the world. And it is repeated, like you said, in the subtitle bit throughout the book too.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't even thought about that. Really, this story is set in Port William, and it is still a story of that Port William membership
Hmm.
because Whitefoot, for as long as she was part of that Port William area, I think she's moved like 15 miles by the end of the story.
Hmm.
But she is part of that Port William membership too.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I like that. Connecting it back to that quote from Burley Coulter, he says, "We're all members, all of us. The difference isn't in who's in and who's out, but who knows it and who don't."
Hmm.
Well, speaking of that Port William membership and the who knows it and who doesn't, that flood, there's all kinds. It brings up all kinds of evidence of humans, like there's the garbage that's floating down the river. There's also the loud boats on the river. Um, and as you said, like it kind of connects back to that old Keith place and potentially, by the way, I'm going off your notes now. How how Troy Chatham may have ruined it
Hmm.
because it does talk in Jayber Crow about how Troy Chatham like was not kind of not worthy of this place that he had inherited and kind of trashed it.
Yeah,
Anything
I
you want
think
to say
that
about your notes there, Dave?
well, I think, even I think that it's also a recognition that even though everyone is the center of our own world, that the things that we do are going to affect those around us. And in the in the story, like Whitefoot makes a nest in old garbage that had been left behind, like in the form of this broken bottle. And like you said, that as the descriptions of the flood are like as Barry describes the effects of the flood throughout, he doesn't focus on it, but he just notes that this flood has not just raised up logs and uprooted old maple trees, but it's like bringing a bunch of human garbage that's been left
Mm.
behind down the river too.
Hmm. Dave, are there other passages that you especially like from this book that you want to highlight?
Yeah, so there's one in particular that always catches me by surprise, which is it's weird that it does, but it's at the very end of the book on page 56. It starts the or it's actually on page 57. It says that day the flood began to subside. The old tree shifted and jolted, breaking the limbs beneath it as it settled toward the ground. but more nights had to pass before the water drew away beneath the tree. And then a little bit later, it says, when the tree finally came to rest on the ground, Whitefoot knew it. She was asleep, but the floating feeling left her, and she woke up. She left her knothole, and though it was not yet completely dark, she began to look around. I so this is a book about a flood, and every time I read it, I my mind does compress to the size of Whitefoot. Like I think Wendell Berry is very effective of that by in doing that. And then I get to that point where it talks about the flood began to subside and this tree settling down, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, this is like an arc narrative.
Mm.
This reminds me so much, especially at that point of the Noah's Ark story in the Old Testament book of Genesis. And I just always it's always such a surprise for me. Like I've read this book half a dozen, 10 times at this point, and every single time I start off thinking, oh, this is about a flood, and then I get lost in the story, and then it connects me back to this part of that this is also a flood narrative like the one in Genesis. And that's always a fun little thing for me. What about you?
Yeah, there are a couple. One is there's a paragraph where he describes her building her nest, and late in the paragraph, he says that Whitefoot did her work according to an ancient honorable principle. Enough is enough. She worked and lived without extravagance and without waste. And
That's
then
such a
there are,
I'm
go ahead, I'm
sorry.
sorry.
That's such a Wendellberry. I mean, it's we were talking
Mhm.
earlier about this being unique to Wendellberry's work, but also of a piece. Like that line in particular is so Wendellberry. I really, really love that.
Yeah. And then I also just love how he describes her movements.
Hmm.
Uh, he, I, there are various descriptions of how sure-footed Whitefoot is once she, especially after dark falls, and she kind of it gets her bearings a little bit, like her other senses come alive. She's very sure-footed, and then Barry also describes in very evocative language the movements of a mouse, and I can easily picture those movements, but I've never tried to describe them myself before. He says a few different times that Whitefoot moves in darts and starts. He says that she appears to hurry, but is really taking her time. And then he says also that she moved in such a way that she simply disappeared, that she seemed to simply disappear in one place and then reappear in another. And, I won't ever look at how a mouse moves the same way again as a
Yeah.
result of that. What about favorite illustrations?
Yeah, I really like the illustrations in this. It was hard to pick one. I think if I had to pick one, there's an illustration early on of Whitefoot curled up in her nest, and her tail is she's in this bedding that she's made. In the book, it describes it as the space that she's made inside their nest that is just big enough for her body, and her tail is wrapped around her, and it's a very it's a very peaceful scene. What about you?
Well, I guess I picked pretty much the exact opposite because she's my favorite is on page 46, and it's night, it's darkest night, and she's awake. These are her waking hours. And for a long time, Barry says that the only sound that Whitefoot can hear is the sound of the flowing river and the rain falling on the water. But then she starts to hear this distant hum that gets louder and louder. And then there's this glow that gets brighter and brighter. And the noise gets louder as the light gets brighter. And so my favorite illustration is on page 46. It's of Whitefoot in the foreground on her branch, and then in the it's in the it's in the distance, but it's like sort of dominating the image is of this glowing light that
Mhm.
is of I think it's of a towboat that's coming her way. And it's a small tiny mouse in a big world, and yet in the image the mouse is quite large in the frame. And the limits of her knowledge, she doesn't know what it is. She doesn't know what it represents. And so again, submitting myself to the limits of her knowledge, she has to, yeah, she has, that's one more thing that she needs to be aware of and cautious of.
Yeah, it's such an evocative scene. I really, just as you were reading that and hearing I could hear the river in my mind. And even I mean I've never been almost run over by a towboat, but that it is it's such a like you can just feel it. I know I've mentioned this before, but Wendell Berry was very effective in just drawing this story down to something small, but not meaningless. Like there's still the smallness of it is not like the stakes don't feel any less significant.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally. Well, should we wrap it up there? Is there something else that we should chat about before we kind of close up this episode?
No, I think that so you had mentioned early on that this is out of print, which is true, and you can't I don't know, I haven't been able to I know they're not making new copies. You can read this on Orion's website though, if you
True.
search
Yeah, good point.
Whitefoot.
Hmm.
Um I don't think the website has I know it doesn't have the illustrations. I don't even think that the website copy has the original photographs that were part of it, but you can read the story, which is nice.
Yeah, we'll link to that story in the show notes so that people can read it. Well, what are we going to read? I guess I already kind of revealed what we're reading next. Next book we're going to talk about is the brand new collection of Sabbath poems called Another Day, Sabbath Poems 2013 to 2023, published by Counterpoint Press. This came out I think just in August. So it's very new. I shared a poem already from from the collection. Dave, is there one that you can share to either one that you're especially excited about talking about next week, or even just a preview, not next week, in our next episode, or just something that offers a kind of a preview of the collection?
Yeah, so I've really loved reading this so far. I've been reading this in the morning. It's the way that one of the ways that I've been entering my day. And it's actually the third poem in the collection and from 2013. And it is this. In a country you know by heart, it is impossible to go the same way twice. Changes of time, mind, weather, and light make all ways new. To one whose eyes have opened, any place is compounded of places unending to the end of time, and travel is well accomplished by standing still.
Hmm, it's pretty good.
I'm a I'm such a homebody anyhow, but now I feel like Wendell Berry is really co-signed on that.
Yeah, I'm also reading it in the morning, taking a cue from you. I think the last five sunrises I have been outside reading the book as the sun has come up. Usually with Ginny next to me, and it's been a really great way of starting my day.
I know we'll talk about this in a whole episode, but it is such a companionable way to start the morning, and you feel like I don't know, I feel like Wendell Berry's writing to me about what it's like to be Wendell Berry in this last decade of his life. It's
Mm.
really a nice a nice thing to read.
Hmm.
I'm excited to talk more about it.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on this episode of the membership. You can connect with us online at www.membershippod.com. We are also on various social channels, infrequently updated, but we are there. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all at Membership Pod. The membership is a proud member of the Rabbit Room Podcast Network, and you can find more great podcasts at rabbitroom.com/podcast. Dave, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to the next time.
Yep, me too. Um, take two. That didn't take long.